Happy October, guys, and for those of you who've been with the channel a while, you know that I like to take this month, the month of October, to talk about exclusively spooky movies, horror movies, Halloween movies, some of my favorites that I always pop on around this time of year to get me in that spooky mood. And before I get started, I just want to kind of issue a apology, confession. I kind of messed up. I uploaded my Aristocats review on the 1st of October, which would have been a golden opportunity to start this Halloween season, but I didn't realize I'd be uploading it on October 1st, and so here we are. And if you've also seen some of my previous October videos, you know that I like to kind of keep it within a theme. The first year I did this, it was Tim Burton month. Then I did the Universal Monsters. Last year, there wasn't much of a theme. It was just some of my guilty pleasures, some of my favorites. And this year is going to be serial killers. Not really the slashers like Freddy Krueger, Jason, Michael Myers. More the psychological horrors. The ones that are closer to real life. The ones that actually have influence or are directly based off of real life serial killers. The ones that get right under your skin and you realize that reality is actually stranger than fiction. I can't think of a better way to kick off this month than with my personal favorite film from the master of suspense himself. Psycho. So Psycho came out in 1960, was directed by Alfred Hitchcock, and was a landmark film, not just for the horror genre, but just for movie-going audiences in general. Audiences in 1960 had really no idea what they were walking into with Psycho. How horrifying it was going to be, how disturbing it was going to be, how graphic it was going to be. But what's really funny looking back on it all these years later is, well, from the modern lens, there really isn't anything that terrifying in it, but really even in 1960, there really wasn't anything that terrifying in it to begin with. It's actually one of the things I love so much about this movie. It's the perfect case of what your mind doesn't see is more horrifying than what it does see, because if you actually look at this film shot by shot, there's actually nothing explicitly gory or violent that you see with your eyes. It's just the way the film is cut up and montaged and edited and had sound design put in and the acting. It tricks your brain into thinking you're seeing truly horrifying things. Oh, and this review is going to be full spoilers, so this is a spoiler warning if you haven't seen Psycho. If you for some reason don't know the twist in Psycho, I'm telling you, go watch the movie right now. It's worth your time. It's a short movie, it's under 2 hours. Just go watch it, come back, and then we can talk about why this is probably the greatest Hitchcock movie ever made. So the movie opens up with Marion Crane, played by Janet Leigh, and she just finished a little afternoon delight with her boyfriend Sam Loomis, played by John Gavin. And this scene basically establishes two things. One, that Marion and Sam are a couple and that they're not married. Sam is divorced, he owes his ex-wife alimony, he's got debts, and so he can't marry her until he's got sure footing. He's from California and they're in Arizona, which is where Marion's from, so they're having kind of a long distance romance. They meet up in hotel rooms and they see each other, but they're also secretive, and Marion doesn't really want to stay secretive. She wants him to commit, and she's willing, and she's in love with him. She wants a future for them. And aside from the trope of an unmarried couple sleeping together, so you know at least one of them's gonna die throughout the course of this movie. That's just slasher movie law at this point. Throughout the first third of this movie, you don't really get the feeling that it's gonna go the way the movie's reputation goes, with the motel and the creepy mother and all that. Really, the first third is all about Marion trying to make a life for her and Sam in California where they can be respectable, where they don't have to meet in secret. And her opportunity comes later that afternoon when this big oil tycoon walks into the office and he's waving around $40,000. He pays her boss $40,000, and the boss, trusting Marion, gives it to her to put in the bank, and Marion, seeing all this money, chooses, well, I'm not going to put it in the bank. I'm going to take it. I'm going to go to California. I'm going to start a new life with my boyfriend so he'll marry me. And I will relieve all of his financial burdens and they'll just start a life together happily ever after. Now you can imagine things don't go that smoothly. And right away, one of the things Hitchcock does really well here is, well, for one, all the side characters have so much personality. The cast they got for this movie are not big name actors. Probably Janet Leigh is the biggest name in here, but really everybody else are all character actors. Yeah, they've been in other things. People would recognize their names back in 1960, but this movie doesn't really have any big stars, and that's probably because this movie was made on the cheap. In fact, it was shot in black and white for that same reason, because Alfred Hitchcock couldn't get funding from Paramount to make this movie because they thought it was too weird and sick and twisted, so he just financed it himself, but he had to do it on the cheap, so he called in a few favors, and because of that, you couldn't get Cary Grant, but he made do with what he had. And the character actors bring so much charm and personality, like this oil tycoon or Marion's boss. They just have these recognizable faces and expressions and line deliveries where you immediately get what they are, the role they fill, and their whole personality in the very limited screen time that these people have. But the other thing you realize early on is the character of Marion is a very interesting character, and I don't think people talk enough about Marion's personality, her character development. The way Janet Leigh plays her is so brilliant, because the whole setup of this financial situation, the relationship, why she makes all of these decisions, why she breaks the law, all this gets set up and acted upon and put in motion within maybe 5 or 10 minutes of screen time. It's very quick visual storytelling. But what I absolutely love about Marion's character here is that she's not particularly good at what she's doing. You definitely get the sense that this woman is not a career criminal. She hasn't robbed from all of her bosses before. This is a new thing that she's entered into, and she is woefully unprepared for this life of crime that she just started. You can tell that by stealing this money, it's gnawing at her conscience. She's trying to think about covering her tracks in all these ways, but then she realizes that while she's covering these tracks, she leaves other tracks open for investigation. And if anyone were to actually investigate her, she's not clever enough or smart enough in the moment to really get away with any of this. And that's portrayed in probably the best use of voiceover I can ever think of in a movie. Because let's be honest, a lot of times voiceover in movies is used to just get out exposition or narration, and it's pretty lazy. A lot of it's tacked on. But Psycho doesn't do any of that. Psycho uses voiceover when Marion is in her car and she's fleeing the scene. She has the stolen money. She is going to California. She's crossing state lines. And she's thinking, and you see her thinking, but you hear voices of other characters, like her boss, like the oil tycoon, and these conversations going on in her head of scenarios that she's not present for. And you're not sure if those conversations actually played out, or if it's just in her head what she thinks they might be talking about behind her back. It's always her getting found out, getting busted because they noticed some clue that she left behind, or something suspicious that she did or said. And this only escalates when she gets pulled over by a cop and she's all jittery because she's got the stolen money in her purse. And watching it again, I'm like, Marion, if you just chilled out and acted normal, there would be no suspicion thrust upon you. But because you're being all awkward and defensive, of course the cop is going to follow you when you try to trade in your car. And also, that's so suspicious, that whole scene at the car dealership when she's trying to pressure the salesman into moving things along, buying a car really quick, and at top dollar too. And it's actually kind of funny thinking about it, because she only swapped out her car, changed license plates, only to avoid the one cop that might suspect her of something based on how she was acting. And the way she sees it, if I have a different car, he won't think anything of that car, he'll be looking for the other car. But the cop finds her at the dealership and watches her change the car right in front of him. So at that point, is it really even worth spending the $700 to switch out your car? I don't know, but it is kind of funny watching her just bumble her way through this. But then she reaches the infamous Bates Motel, and even on first viewing, you realize that, oh, the movie's gonna be different from here on out, isn't it? Because really, from the beginning of the movie till now, this has not been a horror movie or even much of a suspense movie. It's a crime movie. It's a woman who stole a bunch of money and is now running away with it, and the intrigue is, will she get away with it? Or will her inexperience and awkwardness get people suspicious and she'll bust herself ultimately? That's the real driving narrative of this movie so far. But once we meet Norman Bates, you realize this is who the movie's gonna be about, isn't it? Because Anthony Perkins, who plays Norman, gives probably one of the best performances of his day. Maybe even of all of cinema. Because this performance feels so measured and specific and rehearsed, but also very improvisational. And I'm not sure how much of it was improvised and how much of it was word for word from the script, or he was given very specific direction for things, because it just comes off so natural. Because Anthony Perkins just breathes Norman Bates in this movie. It doesn't feel like a performance. It just feels like this is the kind of guy that would operate a rundown motel with his old sick mother in this creepy old house up on the hill. And nobody really stops by at this hotel anyway because it's off the main highway. They moved the highway away from the road that the hotel is situated on. So the only people they get are people that are lost or have veered off path or need desperately someplace to stay for a night while they're going somewhere else. And what can you really say about Norman? I guess he's like a little boy trapped in a grown man's body. He's got that kind of naivete, especially when it comes to women and how to talk to them and not be all nervous and awkward. But also his mannerisms, for some reason, give me Andrew Garfield from The Amazing Spider-Man vibes. And that's not to knock Andrew Garfield and his performance. I'm not saying that his performance was overtly creepy or anything. But there is something about the stuttering, the awkwardness, the body language. That all just seems very similar between the two. But Marion stops by just to spend the night so she can continue her journey the next morning. And he seems very friendly and genuine, if not a little bit awkward and lonely. And they actually do share a pretty nice meal together. At least it starts off that way. He makes her dinner. They eat dinner in the little parlor room where all of his stuffed birds are, which is actually probably one of the creepier set pieces in the movie that I don't really think about a lot when I think about creepy moments here. But just imagine you're Marion and you're sitting in the dark at night in this parlor, and you've got this guy that's a perfect stranger that's a little bit off, and he's got a mother that you just heard screaming at her son. So you're thinking, since he doesn't have the best mother or the best relationship with his mother, he's probably got some issues. And then you're sitting there and you see all these birds, these owls and ravens and things just staring at you with their beady eyes, and they're all hovering, and it just feels like you're trapped in a cage. But nothing bad is happening. Norman seems like a nice guy, and they're having friendly small talk, and they're getting to know each other a little bit, and it's very sweet. He seems so innocent until she starts talking about his mother, and then he gets very defensive when she suggests that he should put her someplace, which means put her in a home or a madhouse or an institution. And Norman's like, no, I'm not going to put her there. I've seen the inside of those things. It's hell on earth. And then he turns it back on Marion, and he's like, who are you to suggest such horrible things? And he gets really angry. And now all the birds seem a lot more threatening, and he seems more threatening, and she's very uncomfortable. And it's just an awkward, tense scene and moment. And then it just kind of resolves. He becomes friendly and charming again. And again, I can't praise Anthony Perkins enough for pulling off this performance. This is a very delicate tightrope to walk when it comes to creep factor and friendly, trustworthy factor. And he just balances that line perfectly where you know something's off, but you can't quite place it. But on the other side, he's not really doing anything wrong. He's not holding her against her will. He's not imposing anything on her. He's just kind of weird. And so Marion just leaves and goes back to her room, and then she goes into the shower to freshen up before bed. And this is when the creep factor with Norman was already there, but then the moment comes when you realize that Norman's no saint either. And it's when he takes a painting off one of the walls in the parlor that borders the first cabin of rooms, which is the one that Marion just happens to be staying at. He's got this peephole, and he's looking in right as Marion's taking off all of her clothes. And while you don't see any nudity in the scene, you do see Marion in a bra, which for 1960 in a stop the press is a woman in a bra. This is the moment when you realize, okay, Norman's not just naive or innocent or awkward. He is a creep, and he's probably a danger to women. And you start thinking, okay, how many women have fallen into his trap? And this is when you start to remember what kind of movie this is. It's a horror movie and a slasher movie, and Norman is suspect number one for who that psycho may be. And now we're here, guys. We've reached the shower scene, and this scene has been talked about to death. It's one of those great cinematic scenes that film people will talk about until they're blue in the face about how great it is and how perfect it is. And I, for one, have nothing to add to the discourse on this scene. That film people have deconstructed and analyzed and posted all kinds of videos about it and the importance of it and everything. And I would just say, watch those. There's a lot of really good stuff in this scene. The fact that throughout all the different shots and angles, there is no nudity shown, which is actually quite a feat considering it's a woman in the shower getting stabbed. The fact that he was able to avoid showing any kind of nudity. Now, there's some shots that come pretty close, but I would say those are still PG-13 at best shots that are suggestive, but they don't really show anything too graphic. This scene also doesn't show any actual violence and stabbing happening to Marion Crane. You never see the knife go inside of her flesh. Now, your brain makes you think you see it because there's such quick images of the knife and her skin and her face and her hands, and it's just all rapid succession. And the music kicks on at just the right moment, and it's startling, and you're like, oh my gosh, Mrs. Bates is taking it upon herself to wipe out the temptation from her son's life. Also, you're kind of thinking, why aren't we seeing Mrs. Bates' face? You just see this wig and dress and knife in hand, and that's a little suspicious. I guess now's a good time to mention the iconic score that Bernard Herrmann made for this movie, the piercing strings that just go It's one of those scores and musical cues that have just become so synonymous with the slasher genre and slasher movies. It's been parodied, it's been homaged, it's been referenced to death. If you've ever heard those strings in conjunction with stabbing or a killer or screaming, it's a reference to Psycho. What can I say? And the reason why composers still use that to this day is because Psycho did such a good job creating that atmosphere of tension and fear, all culminating in this shower scene where the fear is on full display and you see the murder happen. And Marion Crane, the star of the movie, about a third of the way in, dies. And she doesn't die only to come back later or as a twin sister or as a misunderstanding. And that was probably one of the biggest risks a director has ever made in Hollywood. Having the star of your movie murdered a third of the way in, not even making it to halfway in the runtime, never to be seen again. And then afterwards, the movie takes a whole nother left turn. Now it's an investigation type movie. Because now that Marion's dead, Norman comes down and sees what his mother did and is horrified, and he, like a dutiful son, cleans up the body, throws it all in the car, drives the car into the swamp, destroying all the evidence, and now everything's clean. Now, people are still going to want to know where that $40,000 went, especially the people that Marion stole it from in the first place. So now we're introduced to Marion's sister, Lila Crane, played by Vera Miles. And the first time I saw this movie, I just thought of her as like Marion Part 2, right? We lost one blonde-headed girl named Crane in the shower. Here's the other one, and she's going to kind of pick up where Marion left off. But really, Vera Miles gives a very different performance than Janet Leigh gave as Marion. Lila is very headstrong, businesslike, and determined, where Marion was a bit more your typical 60s, 50s housewife, secretary, just wanting to fit in, get her little slice of heaven with her boyfriend. I never really got the impression that Marion had these big aspirations or desires in life, aside from Sam and just kind of cutting out a simple life. Lila, I get the impression she is a businesswoman. She's successful. She's much more no-nonsense. In fact, she goes to Sam because she suspected that he was in on this whole theft to pay off his debt so that they could be together. She put all that together. But sadly for Sam, he wasn't in on any of this. She never visited him. She never communicated that with him. And now the movie switches genres again. It's not really a slasher. It's not really a fugitive on the run from the police kind of story. Now it's a detective film noir mystery movie, which is my personal favorite kind of movies. Those are my jam. I will watch those any day of the week. And Hitchcock really starts laying on the film noir tropes thick when this private investigator comes along named Arbogast, and he's played by Martin Balsam, who you might recognize from The Twilight Zone or 12 Angry Men, or he's just been in a lot of things around this time. His face just pops up everywhere. And he's a great character actor. He's awesome in this role, and he's working on behalf of the oil tycoon who lost this money, and he's trying to figure out where Marion went so that he can get the money back. So they start communicating, sharing what they know, which admittedly isn't much, but through some investigative legwork, Arbogast stumbles onto the Bates Motel where he meets Norman Bates. He starts asking some of the questions, and true to form, Norman starts getting real defensive when things start getting a little too personal. But of course, Arbogast isn't satisfied with any of this, and it only raises more red flags, and he goes into the house now. And this is actually the first time where we see the inside of the house, the Bates house. And the house just looks like something out of the Munsters or the Addams Family. It's this real creepy old architecture house that just looks haunted, and any sensible person would stay very far away from it, would definitely not walk up through the front door of it and go up the stairs blindly. And that was Arbogast's mistake, because here we get the second murder of the movie, and that's when Mrs. Bates comes out of her bedroom, knife in hand. It's actually quite an effective jump scare, because the way the camera work is, he's kind of asking like, hey, Mrs. Bates, thinking she's a sick old woman, infirmed, invalid, she can't walk. And then we see the door open just a crack, and then immediately that score kicks on, and you see Mrs. Bates making a beeline for Arbogast with the determination of someone half her age, and she just stabs him. He falls down the stairs, and she stabs him again, and again, you don't actually see any stab. And that's just the beauty of Hitchcock's style. It's the stuff that we don't see that fills in the gaps. You don't know what a bloody mess Arbogast was at the bottom of those stairs when Mrs. Bates was finished with him. But I guarantee you, whatever mental picture is in your head when you see that knife, yeah, that's where the real horror of this movie starts to sink in. But now I gotta wrap up this movie fast because this video is going on for long enough and there's really not that much movie left. It's actually a really quick, efficient way that they wrap up this movie. Because now that the investigator's gone missing, Lila and Sam take it upon themselves to go investigate because I guess they're just too curious, they need answers, and they can't help themselves. Because any sensible person would realize that if you go near the Bates Motel, you ain't coming back. This is a proto-slasher movie, and in slasher movies, they don't always make the best decisions. Psycho's no exception, because Lila and Sam go investigating, and Lila actually goes into the house alone, which, you don't do. This is where I get my personal favorite scene in the movie, and it's when you have Lila looking around the house. She goes into the basement, the fruit cellar, because that's actually where Norman hid Mrs. Bates after the second murder, because now the police are getting a little suspicious of all this too. So he moves her into the fruit cellar to keep her out of, the eye of the public and make it look like Norman's alone up there. Because I just realized I glossed this over. We learned from the sheriff that Mrs. Bates had been dead for 10 years. So who is this Mrs. Bates that's been killing people? Because if Mrs. Bates is up there, who's buried in the cemetery? And it's really around this time when probably most people, if not everybody who watches this movie, can piece together what is going on. But as someone who's had this twist spoiled for me well before I've even seen the movie, I do like to kind of suspend my disbelief every time I watch it, almost playing dumb and going along with the assumptions and acting clueless. And the movie does allow for that. If you don't think too hard and you just kind of let the movie go, you can be fooled into thinking that Mrs. Bates was the killer the whole time, which in a sense she was. But also the movie never cheats. It never shows you anything that goes against the twist later on. There's always clues and breadcrumbs that will lead you to the final solution in the end. That's what makes Psycho so much fun to watch over and over again. But it's when Lila goes in the fruit cellar and she sees Mrs. Bates sitting in a chair and she turns her around and you see a corpse of Mrs. Bates. And then you put it together that Mrs. Bates is dead, that Mrs. Bates couldn't have done any of those killings, and that it had to be Norman. And then right when you're putting all of this together, you see Norman screaming in the voice of his mother, running down the stairs, wig, dress, knife in hand, ready to stab Lila. But then thankfully Sam is not far behind and he restrains Norman. And that's probably, for me, the most terrifying scene in the whole movie. Yeah, a lot of people couldn't go back into the shower after that shower scene. That never really bothered me. Really, this is the scene that just gave me the creeps from day one, still gives me the creeps, because it's the face that Norman makes in the scene. It's this die-hard commitment to this role he's adopted, this psychosis that's in his head. It's this look of like a rabid animal, and it's just so unsettling and inhuman. Even just talking about it gives me the creeps. But this is the end of the movie, because now all's revealed. We get it. Norman did all the murders. It was a split personality thing. He couldn't let go of his mother. And he killed Marion. He killed Arbogast and all that. We get it. But apparently not everybody in 1960 got it, because we got this last minute edition scene after Norman got arrested and is put in jail. The authorities are trying to figure out, well, what is actually going on with these killings? So they call in the psychiatrist played by Lieutenant Schrank from West Side Story, and he kind of just spills all the beans about Norman and the fact that he's got a split personality, that the mother personality has taken over his whole mind, and that Norman never really existed wholly to begin with. And all the exposition and explaining for all the people in the audience that are too stupid to put it together themselves. Here we have it all spelled out for you, clear as day. And a lot of people, especially in film circles, give this scene a lot of grief for being unnecessary, because everything that the psychiatrist says we could have figured out just in due course throughout the movie. And especially watching the movie a second time, you can put everything together. However, I never really had that distaste for it, because I thought a nice wrap-up for everything that went down was kind of warranted. Especially considering that in the last part of this movie, it really does become a proper murder mystery story and not just a slasher story. So I don't really see it as much different than at the end of a Sherlock Holmes story when he explains all the clues and lays it all out for you. Or at the end of an Agatha Christie story with Hercule Poirot explaining everything and explaining all the clues and putting it all together for you. But I will say that this scene is worth it for two brief moments that we do get because of this scene, and it's the closing moments with Norman Bates, or I guess Norma Bates, in this movie. And the first moment that just gives me chills down my spine every time is when one of the officers tells them that Norman requested a blanket, can I give it to him? And they say yeah. So we see them open the door to the cell he's in, and you don't see inside the cell right away, but you hear Norma's voice say thank you. And that just again sends chills down my spine when I hear that woman's voice coming out of him. It's just so creepy and effective. It's great. But then it doesn't stop there, because we do end up seeing inside the cell. We see Norman in the blanket, and he's not talking, but it's voiceover. Again, brilliant use of voiceover in this movie. And it's Norma's voice giving this monologue about not hurting the fly. And then you see Norman look up right at the camera, and there's a dissolve, and it's probably my favorite dissolve in any movie ever. And it dissolves from Norman's face to them pulling the car out of the mud in the swamp. But in the middle of those two shots during the dissolve, very briefly, they also dissolve in, superimposing the Mrs. Bates skull corpse face on top of Norman's face for a brief moment where you start to see the skull-like teeth and the sunken eyes as it dissolves into the final image, which is them pulling the car out of the mud. And that's just brilliant. It's so subtle, but you get it. You recognize it. You recognize the intent behind it, and the movie just says the end, and that is Psycho, Alfred Hitchcock's most famous film. It changed the game when it came to horror and suspense and just disturbed psychological storytelling. It really broke a lot of boundaries in those regards, but also it's just a phenomenally made film, just on a technical level. This is Alfred Hitchcock at the top of his game without any kind of studio restraints. It's actually the censors that had the biggest input in what he could and couldn't do, because he really pushed the boundary. That whole shower scene alone was a headache for the censors. Not just because it's a scene where a woman gets stabbed to death in the shower. Obviously censors are going to have an issue with that. It's because right before that scene, you see Marion flush a toilet. I still have no idea what the censor's problem with that was, but apparently it was such a big deal because never before in an American film has it been shown a person flushing a toilet. They thought it was the most disgusting, vulgar thing you could show in a movie, and it just seems kind of silly by today's standards. But anyway, those are my thoughts on Psycho. Have you seen it? What do you think about it? I should hope you've seen it, because if not, I just spoiled the whole movie for you. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. As always, I'm Colby. This is My Dirty Talk, and I'll see you in the next video.